Carmen Garces, will be supporting with any questions and monitoring the chat throughout the session. I'm excited now to introduce our absolutely awesome presenter, Ms. Rebecca Field, for this workshop. Thank you all and have a wonderful session.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I'm glad to know that you guys are handling everything. My name is Rebecca Field, and I'm really happy to be here with you. I'm going to share my PowerPoint right now for a second so that we can start with that. I'm going to try to be very mindful of time. Can you see it? Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as she mentioned, my title is Bilingual Educators, Professional Learning and Racial Justice. And like probably a lot of you, I'm feeling the urgency of now. Whether it be Black Lives Matters, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian American racism, conflict and controversy over what racism means, what we at least know now in a way that we haven't known before is that we have systemic racism pervasive and destructive throughout our institutions here in the United States today. We can see it in healthcare with the pandemic, we can see it in policing, and we can also see it in schooling. I've been working in this field for about 30 years, I guess. I'm trained as a sociolinguist, and what I'd like to do with you today is to share with you some of the lessons that I've learned about anti-racism, about anti-minoritizing education through ethnographic field work that I've done at Oyster Bilingual School. It's one of the first bilingual programs in the United States. And then bilingual ethnographic research in Philadelphia, where I live and where I am right now. And then building on that, developing dual language programs in the 5 top community languages in Philadelphia, which were Khmer or Cambodian, Mandarin, Russian, Vietnamese, and Spanish. Then I want to continue and draw on some examples from different bilingual programs that I've reviewed in different parts of the country, particularly one in North New Jersey, that's Spanish-English bilingual, and one in Washington, Bellevue, Washington, also Spanish-English bilingual. What I'm going to try to do today is focus on the importance of teachers as agents for change, as teachers learning how to look and learning how to listen and learning how to see what kind of inequities are going on in our schools so that we can challenge the inequities that we find. If you have any questions at any time, just put them in the chat. And I think that Carmen is going to help me with the chat later on. And if
I'm sorry, Dr. Phil, there's a question about the slides. Do you want participants to write you?
Yeah, if you want to, you can put your name and your email address in the chat. And if Carmen will save the chat, I will send the slides to everyone. That will be no problem whatsoever. But you don't even know what they look like yet. So let's carry on. Let me know at the end. Okay, so here's the guiding questions that we're going to work with today. Number 1, how do educational discourses shape the social construction of student identities in our schools? In other words, how do students understand what it means to be ELL, or bilingual, or Latino, or Guatemalan, or Central American, or African American? That's not the same everywhere, so we need to look locally. What we know is we can expect inequities in the system no matter where, and what we need to be able to do, my second question, is how can we resist educational discourses that minoritize students in order to create equitable, enriching alternatives in our classrooms and schools? And what we're going to do, I'm a linguist, so we're going to focus on language or discourse broadly defined throughout the session. Can you hear me okay? Is everything okay? Yes. So funny not to be with you. Okay, my focus and most of my work has been on language ideologies. What I mean by language ideologies, I'd like you to think about this as I'm talking about what's happening in your school, because the point of my presentation today is to help you look locally and understand what's happening so you can challenge what's happening there. So language ideologies can be understood as beliefs about languages and speakers of those languages. that are enacted in everyday communicative practices, like in classroom interaction, like in the unofficial discourse at the school, and they're also in office meetings, in teacher meetings, and they're also structured by power relations that are racializing and minoritizing. When I think of power, I understand power as symbolic domination, exercised largely through discourse. Of course, there's other kinds of power, but this is what we're going to focus on here. And the great thing about looking at power as symbolic domination is you can always resist it. There's the possibility of resistance and transformation through discourse. And some of this work comes from my earlier, some of the earlier work that I've done. These people, Schifflin, Willard, and Crosscredy, were very influential in my thinking. Susan Gao, as in Gallon Irvine, was one of my teachers earlier on. And then you might know Jonathan Rosas' work on ratiolinguistics right now, which is what's happening, more recently. In the United States, our language ideologies are structured by Black-white power relations. This has been so obvious to me this year. It also seems that we need to understand the complex relation between language, race, identity, and power at the local level. Just think for a minute what happens in Atlanta this week. We have anti-Asian discourses swirling around in the United States, all kinds of assumptions and expectations and stereotypes and stigmas that create an environment where Asian Americans are terrified right now, especially when there's been the shootings in the massage parlors. What we know is there's a lot of questions about, does this count as racism? Is this sexism? Is it, what's going on? Well, we know there's controversy, but we can see that there are inequities. So let's look more locally. I started my career, I was a graduate student at Georgetown University. This was in 1989. And I was very interested in how bilingual schools can structure their programs and practices so that all kids can achieve from whatever background. Oyster Bilingual School is the third dual language program started in the United States. It's been in operation since 1971. I spent 2 years there. And what I learned is that the Oyster educators, individually and as a collective, oppose what they talked about as mainstream educational discourse. And they complained because in mainstream schools, there was no official language policy. Think about what's happening in your schools. And what do we know when there's no official language policy in the United States? English only. We see English only classrooms, and students' bilingualism is rendered invisible in a lot of the mainstream classrooms. We can see that English is attributed more status in school and in society, especially standard English, spoken by white middle class speakers. We can see pervasive discrimination against Spanish and Spanish speakers and other minoritized groups. We can see a Eurocentric curriculum and materials. Let me just stop here for a second. I'm a white girl. You guys might be able to notice, although I'm looking a little pink. And I grew up in a white middle class environment, and I was exposed only to a Eurocentric curriculum before I started doing this kind of work. Since last May, I've been reading a lot of African American history, and I've come to realize that the history that I learned isn't at all reflective of what has actually happened. And this has made me believe that we need to have much more representative curriculums. I'm not alone in this. Classroom interaction is traditionally structured by white English-speaking norms, and white English-speaking boys continue to dominate. And we see standardized testing only in English. I'm hoping as I say this, that you're thinking about what's happening in your schools, and you're thinking, oh, you know what, we can see traces of those mainstream discourses in our school. I see some of that, not all of it, but some of it. Well, what Oyster did is they had created what I called an alternative educational discourse. This is from my book. My name was Freeman at the time, Bilingual Education and Social Change, and there's references at the end of the slides. What the Oyster educators decided to do is to have a 50-50 Spanish-English dual language bilingual program school-wide for all students. They started as a strand. They started in kinder, just like a lot of people do, but in order to have their equal access agenda met, it needed to go first throughout the strands and then school-wide, so that everyone would see Spanish and English as more or less equal. One of the pre-K teachers, I spent a year in pre-K, and one of the teachers sent, not when I was in pre-K, but I mean when I was in Oyster, one of the teachers said to me, Rebecca, as I'm asking about language, dual language, they said, it's much more than language. And I was like, what? What does this mean? And what I described this as an identity project, a social identity project that's intended to elevate the status of Spanish, Spanish speakers, and other minoritized students. Spanish and Spanish speakers are positioned as equal to English and English speakers in all representations and interactions. This is complicated because it's every kind of a way that you're using language, everywhere in the curriculum, everywhere in policy, in announcements to parents, in what makes up the community council, etc. There was equity for Black and Brown students. They had a strong racial justice lens, but at this particular year, this was in 1989 when I started, they weren't calling it exactly that, but it was very obvious. For example, I spent a year in the 6th grade. It's fun to go from pre-K to 6th grade. Their curriculum was very representative of the people in the building. And I think this is an important point. Whoever you have in your schools and your classrooms, the curriculum needs to represent and positively evaluate all of these kids. For these, in my 6th grade classroom, one of the teachers, the English speaker, was African American, and she had a very strong African-centric curriculum content. And in fact, how's my time? Should I tell you a story? No, I won't. I won't even get carried away with my stories. Won't even get carried away with stories because we're not in person.
20 minutes, 20 minutes.
Okay, we want to look at, they're focusing on equity for Black and Brown students, representative curriculum, as I mentioned. I'll just tell you the quick story. When I went to Oyster the first day in the 6th grade class, a little blonde 6th grader, white, came up to me and said, Rebecca, can you locate all of the countries in Africa on a map? And I said, excuse me, I'm not sure. No one's ever asked me that before. And she gave me her map of Africa, and she was horrified at how few places I could find. But as part of their African-centric curriculum, they knew all of the countries in Africa. They understood histories. Say, since their teachers were from all over Latin America, the same. Different kinds of Spanishes, different kinds of histories, different kinds of literatures, different kinds of perspectives. There was inclusive classroom interaction. The 6th grade teacher, one of them, the Spanish dominant teacher, quote unquote, said, you know, Latino students have to learn how to ask. English speakers, middle class students in the United States, they all know how to ask. They think they're entitled to everything. But a Latino student won't think that they have the right to ask. So my job as the teacher is to help them gain the ability and the right to ask questions. So you could see this perspective on pro-multilingual, anti-racist everywhere that they were. It was interesting though, because even in the most perfect world, which of course this was not, there's leakage between the ideal plan, balanced Spanish and English, and the actual implementation. And in 1998, well, in 1989 to 1992, when I was there was standardized testing only in English. There was no assessment in Spanish. Unfortunately, one of the things that I found in my work over the last couple decades is that even today, in 2021, we don't find a lot of dual language programs with authentic assessments of biliteracy. And this is something that I think is an absolutely critical way for us to move forward with in our equity work. So let me tell you about the places that I went. I used what I learned at Oyster to kind of guide all of my work. I had no idea that they were so particular when I was there. So the one thing that I want to tell you is that they were an established dual language program when I saw them. They were primarily low-income Salvadoran and middle-income Black and white. Now, this is important when we think about race, class, and language, because what we see is that Spanish is lined up with Salvadoran, is lined up with low-income, is lined up with one neighborhood in Washington, D.C. at the time. And English is not white, but it's Black and white, mostly African-American, but middle income in that particular context. They all participate in a 50-50 dual language program, and there was an explicit focus on positioning students from diverse backgrounds as equal. This is really challenging, and it's something we have to do minute by minute. So I went on, I moved to Philadelphia, I got a job at University of Pennsylvania, and I started to work in the North Philadelphia, Puerto Rican and Dominican neighborhood. And I wrote a book there called Building on Community Bilingualism. And after I'd been there for about 3 or 4 years, the head of the school district of Philadelphia, Office of Language and Cultural Equity, invited me to be the leader of a dual language initiative program that was going to start 10 dual language programs in the top 5 communities, as I mentioned before: Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, Khmer, and Vietnamese. Now, what was very interesting about this work is we didn't have materials and resources in Russian, Mandarin, Khmer, and Vietnamese to be able to have a full dual language program with at least 50% of the time in the language other than English and 50% in English. We did in Spanish. So we started dual language programs in the Spanish schools, but we decided we can't just do nothing just because we can't do everything. And I think that this is such an important message for folks right now. You know, just because we can't have the perfect dual language program because of our resources, because of our teachers, because of whatever else we have, doesn't mean we can't do anything. We can do something. What we did, they were very interested in integration. So we had community language programs that brought together, in the Russian neighborhood was mostly middle income, mostly white. So it brought together Russian speakers and English speakers to learn Russian, and the group was really interested in Russian literature. The Russians, to give you an idea about language ideologies, the Russians were really interesting because the Russian community originated back when a lot of Russians were emigrating for religious purposes a number of decades ago. And people thought when the new Russians came to the neighborhood that they should be in the same neighborhood with the older Russians. But there was such a conflict by the Russians about what counted as Russian. The peasants who have been here a long time, or the more intellectual Russians who've just come. The reason I mention this is because the way the groups that you're working with, the kids and the parents, identify themselves relative to the other groups is really critical for us to understand, because what I see as true might not be at all to somebody else's perspective. They were in very different kinds of neighborhoods. Spanish was in the worst neighborhood in terms of lowest performing. And the school district of Philadelphia was engaged in, quote unquote, the largest experiment in educational reform in the country at the time. And so all the schools that were really struggling were taken over by various providers. And what happened is the Spanish schools were the most struggling, and there was a big conflict between educational reform from the outside and what we wanted to do from the inside. I go on, the goals, I said very different neighborhoods, demographics, and goals need to have their goals in mind. As I mentioned, and you can see, am a middle-class white girl. It occurred to me that Spanish is a really important world language, and Russian and Mandarin, but I at first couldn't understand why anybody would want to study Khmer in the Cambodian neighborhood. And boy, was I wrong. The classes were very well populated by African-American and Cambodian students. The parents were enthusiastic, and everybody was really excited to have all of the kids speak the local community language. It never even occurred to them, the larger environment, they cared about what was happening right now. With respect to New Jersey, when I did a program evaluation, this one's really interesting. Think about your place. Well, actually, all of them are interesting to me. They had a dual language program in every school, pre-K through 12, that enrolled English-speaking, Spanish-speaking, and bilingual Latinx students. They wanted to strengthen it, but they were very proud of this equitable program, not just for English language learners, but for all bilingual students. Since there was a program in every school, when I was reviewing the program, of course, I met all the principals. And one of the principals told me, Rebecca, why can't the Black students go to the dual language program in my school? You know, this is an equity issue, Rebecca. And one of the things that was happening in this district is we had 2 separate districts. One was bilingual and one was African American. And if you started to bring them together, that would be a way to start to challenge some of those segregated communities. And then in Washington, in Bellevue, Washington, this is in Seattle, and it's in Microsoft land. It's a very wealthy neighborhood. Again, I was brought in to review their dual language program, and I never look at a dual language program in isolation. I always look at it in relation to what else is happening in the district. So what did I find? There was a dual language program that they'd started for low-income Latinos that only was for low-income Latinos. That was the group that was struggling the most. But there was a bilingual immersion program, they called it, for white students who were learning Spanish. Now, what was interesting about this place is because of their assumptions and expectations about who can do what with language, they kept the two groups separate. Another thing that happened in that particular district, so I went back after I helped them start and review in the first year, and I went back 6 years later to see how they were doing. And they'd grown their dual language programs considerably. They were doing really well, all of them. But I looked closely at the demographic data because somebody said to me, you know, Rebecca, dual language education might be all that, but our ESL students are doing better than our dual language students. And I said, really, how can that be happening? And when we looked closely at the demographics, we saw the students in the dual language program were low income, brown and black. The students in the ESL program were middle and upper income Asian who worked in them like in Microsoft and the other tech places there, largely Chinese and Indian. And so you can't say that English is better than dual language, English only. It's much more complicated than that, much more complicated. And if we look down at the number of different Indian languages and Chinese languages, you'd find variation within there at all. So the point about telling you all of these is to try to evoke some, when I talk about specifics, hopefully you can identify specifics in your place that you'll want to think about a little bit further. You'll want to open your eyes to. What we know, because what we know is that language, race, and class and gender intersect differently in different ways. That's the important part. It's not separate: language, race, identity, gender. No. They all interact in different ways for the people we're talking to in different places. So this comes from, this is kind of a summary of what I was doing at Oyster Bilingual School, but it's also summarized really beautifully by Esther de Jong, who's unfortunately presenting right now, so you guys can't be there. But Esther wrote a book for us, Caslon Publishing, and she reviewed the national and international literature and came up with 4 principles for multilingual schools. Strive for educational equity, and to do that, affirm identities, promote bilingualism, structure for integration. If you heard Jim Cummins yesterday, you probably heard him talk about a number of these themes. And a lot of the people throughout the conference will be talking about these themes. What's interesting to me is when I go into a school, I don't see a coherent educational discourse. What I usually see is conflict and controversy or incoherence or something. So I might see in one classroom, if the bilingual program is not really well implemented, I might see one teacher think that their job is to use Spanish to get to English. And I might see another teacher say they use Spanish because they want to promote Spanish. And if all of the teachers don't have the same beliefs and practices around bilingual education, it's not going to be a coherent experience for the kids. So our job is to identify where we have the racist discourses, the particulars, curriculum, policy, practice, extracurricular, homeschool relations, and then move. In those, we see that minority students are absent, invisible, and negatively evaluated. So start looking at the language people are using. In a more multilingual, anti-racist discourses, minoritized students are included, they're seen and heard, and they're positively evaluated. You hear a lot about people saying we need to start with students' assets. That's part of it. That's part of the multilingual anti-racist discourse. It's just one piece. This comes from Ibrahim Kendi, 2019. He does a lot of work on anti-racism, and I've been reading a lot of his work since over this year. And what he said is, when you truly believe that racial groups are equal, then you also believe that racial disparities must be the result of racial discrimination. And so that's what we need to do at the level. We need to, as teachers, take a look at what's happening with our different identity groups. And I'll show you a couple steps for that in just a minute. And what Kennedy says, he says that anti-racism is characterized by self-critique first and foremost, because racism isn't something that's out there. It's something that's in my head and in my interaction with others. So in order for me to challenge racist discourses at school or minoritizing discourses at school, I have to look really critically at what I believe. And when I find myself believing something like, oh, well, of course it's that way because of blah, 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 I have to catch myself and say, no, Rebecca, that's racist. You're trying really hard. How can you reframe that? What can you do to talk about that and act on that differently? Then we have to discover. One of my mantras is to look for somebody who already knows how to do something well. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheels. If you're doing dual language programs, go find people who are successful, discover what they're doing, and then figure out ways to shed our racist ideas and shed our racist practices. This work is complicated, and it does not happen in a minute. So what I want to do now is take it to your contexts. There's 4 steps. I could give you, oh God, I've been working on this for decades now, but I'm just going to give you 4 easy steps in 5 minutes that you can think about. Step 1, when you're in your school, in your classroom, wherever it is that you're working, identify the major social identity groups that your students represent and include the terms that are used in the context. So for example, is race important? Is language, background important? Is ethnicity important? Is class important? Is gender important? Take a look at what kinds of identities seem to be mattering, and then take a look, keep your eyes open for how they're represented and how they're evaluated in different places. Step 2, like you might see, for example, in the curriculum, they had, okay, I'm going to take you to New Jersey for a second. They had the bilingual programs everywhere, but they had, as many of you might have, an influx of Central American middle school kids from Guatemala, largely. And a lot of the kids, although they came from Guatemala, the teachers all thought they should speak Spanish because that's the language of Guatemala. But the fact is, a lot of the kids spoke indigenous languages, and not all of the kids spoke Spanish, or they had varying expertise in Spanish, English, and Mam or the other indigenous languages. And the teachers didn't have any idea what to do with this. This is where translanguaging, which I'll take you to in a minute, what we need to do is bring all of the languages and all of the identities into the room, positively evaluate them, and see what we can do. How can we build on that? Even when we don't have as many materials in one thing or another. What we need to do, this comes from Kendi again, look for evidence of difference, hierarchy, and inequity in representations, practices, and outcomes. A lot of times people will talk about multilingualism or multiculturalism as about differences and celebrating differences, but it's not enough to be recognizing and celebrating differences. We have to understand how power relations structure the way we evaluate each other and the opportunities we make available. And then when you look in your context, propose a concrete project. Start small. I never do, but go ahead. And to challenge particular inequities that you find. Implement your project, reflect on implementation, and provide evidence of how that project improved equitable opportunities for minoritized students. Okay, I'm going to take you over to the Translanguaging Classroom on Caslon Learning in just a second, but I want to
we have 10 minutes left.
Okay, good. I'm good. Thank you. This is exactly where I wanted to be. Loving it. Okay, I want to show you a summary of this particular part, just to pull it together. The proposal that, oh, and I didn't do the summary yet. What I want to do is to talk about the challenge that they were working on in Oyster School, that people are working on in different schools right now, and that the Translanguaging Classroom addresses. One of the challenges we find in schools everywhere in this crazy country we're in is the languages other than English, and speakers of those languages are minoritized and racialized at school. We see it everywhere. The proposal Embrace all of the languages that your students bring with them to school as an integral part of who they are. Don't ask them to leave their language and identity at the door in order to learn. It's not how it works. Learn to leverage those languages for learning and level the playing field. I'm a publisher for Caslon Publishing. It's a little company, although I love that Carmen said it's not so little. I'm trained as a sociolinguist, and my husband is trained as a publisher. So we started a little business, Caslon Publishing, and we make books exclusively for the professional development of educators who work with language in multilingual learners in different contexts. So a new tool that I've been making, and you could tell me what you think. I showed it to another group. Let's see. Rebequita. Just a second, I'm trying to do way beyond my capacity. I'll be right back, I promise you. Oh, Rebecca, why do you always do this?
Is there anything I can do to help?
I got it. I'm so excited. Okay, so what I'm trying to do, one of the things that I learned from Oyster Bilingual School is that if you want to challenge racist discourses, minoritizing discourses, the mainstream's not going to do it for you. You've got to do it yourselves. People who can see it and understand it have to do some of the work, a lot of the work themselves. I'm very interested in the idea of teachers as agents for change. I'm very interested in helping teachers get together and learn at some of the big ideas in the field, get their head around what it might mean in their context, and then apply it to their own context. So we have the book, The Translanguaging Classroom, and we're featuring it on this new system that I'm developing called Caslon Learning, and I'm only going to show you one or two things. Oh no, don't! Not again. Be quiet, Rebecca. I did that twice today. I'm so sorry. I hope you're working with me. So what you can see is that each of the chapters has, these are the different chapters of the book, 1 through 11, and you have pre-reading questions, key terms, activities, but I want to show you something about reflection and action. Create a preliminary profile of a multilingual classroom or make a preliminary profile of a program for bilingual learners. Caslon Learning is not for the individual, it's for groups. So groups can work together and they can all do these activities, look at the book, etc. But then what you can do is create a preliminary profile. And what we've given you is, we referred you to the book where you can look at examples and models. We give you a number of questions about who are your bilingual students? Who is the teacher? What kinds of language ideologies does he or she bring with them to school? What are the content, language, and literacy goals for diverse learners? And it's really interesting because sometimes what we say the goals are, when we look closely, they're not actually the goals we have at all. So we need to look at policy and practice, explicit and implicit. How are languages used officially and unofficially in the classroom? We learn a lot about language ideologies this way. How are students performing? This is a really important part for outcomes. And what happens is you can write and then you can share your profile. So the group is going to be working with the Translanguaging Classroom to look at how their students use languages, what they bring with them to the classroom to be able to share. On the last one, you can upload, you can do like a video if you want to or whatever, but what you can share with your colleagues, they can I'll show you, wait a second. How many minutes do I have? 5, okay, good, I'm perfect. Okay, thank you. So I wrote this just as an example. This is from the book. Pretty much what I did is I just answered these questions from the book. What we're trying to do with this system is help teachers take ownership of and responsibility for their own and each other's professional learning. And we know that a lot of teachers haven't been trained to do this. So what we're trying to do is make it as step-by-step as possible, because you guys are the experts. So I just wrote down, who are the students? And we talk about who the students are, what kinds of things they bring with them to the class? Who is the teacher? And so your group can follow that. When you write it, people can comment on it. It's really interesting when one person knows a lot about a group at the school and another person doesn't know very much about the group. When they're responding like this, they can learn the most from each other's interactions. And then what you can do is share what you're doing with your classmates, etc. So what I've tried to do with you today is to tell you something about how we can, the notion that language, that identity, racial identity, gender identity, language minority identity, identities are socially constructed through discourse. In the policies that we make, in the curriculum that we create, in the materials that we develop, in the way we structure interaction, extracurricular opportunities, all these different ways. And what if we want to provide equitable opportunities, we need to look closely at how language positions the students in our own place. When we find that the kids that are normally minoritized are doing really well, celebrate and share. When we find inequities, talk to our colleagues and figure out a way to be able to do something differently and potentially transform. Ideally, teachers as agents for change, bilingual educators as agents for change, will be able to work together, professionalize the work they're doing, and share out with others so we can continue to move this field forward from the bottom up. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you.
I just want to say, I know I met with you during the exhibitor hall. This is Shanti again. Shanti. Hi. I really appreciate this because I think that we all have a lot of, introspection to do, and also a lot of that we have to constantly reevaluate where we're at and what we've achieved and where we want to go. And I think,
and challenge our assumptions all the way along, because I find myself, I've been doing this work for like 30 years, and I constantly catch myself saying, God, Rebecca, where did that come from? What were you thinking about? Oh, I need to learn a little bit more. I need to read more. I need to find somebody who knows what they're talking about. I need to think about how this plays out in the context in which I'm working. I need to play a little bit, and I need to try to restructure. Eureka, did you want to say something? Any other comments or questions, Carmen?
There were no questions, but they were very positive comments and affirmations to what you were saying about students' identity and valuing their language.
Yeah, I think that identity is where all the action is. And to really, for me as a linguist, to really focus on how identities are constructed, like if the notion of positioning to me is central, I learn who I am as a woman, as a presenter, as an ethnographer, as a wife, as a white girl, through my interactions with other people. I can't position myself exclusively by myself as a particular kind of being. The interactions that I have with others will shape the way that I view myself and the opportunities I have available to me. So as teachers, we are in very powerful positions to look at how does the language we use influence the opportunities for these different kids to be able to achieve in our classrooms, participate and achieve, shine. And you know how you can sometimes see, oh my God, I did something really wrong there. That child is just cringing at me. I have to figure out a way to bring them back in. I can't just shock them. You know, I don't want to embarrass them right now, but I want to figure out a way to affirm the identity, affirm what they were doing so that we can move on together. Because if we're not in this as a community, teachers, students, parents, school, we're not going to be able to move it forward.
Thank you so much.